Topic 49B, the impact of Brown, the modern civil rights movement, 1955 to 1965. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you'll need these notes to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to describe the mixed impact of the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education, identify major figures, protest movements, and legislative achievements of the modern civil rights movement, and understand the importance of grassroots efforts, bottom-up change, and nonviolent civil disobedience to the success of the movement. In the last podcast, we learned that the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, decided in 1954 that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, and ordered that states should desegregate their schools with all deliberate speed. Not surprisingly, this vague mandate allowed Southern states to maintain segregated educational facilities well after 1954, and federal action was often required to force states to comply with the decision in Brown v. Board of Ed. The famous Little Rock Nine successfully desegregated Arkansas Central High only with the assistance of the 101st Airborne Division called in by President Eisenhower. Likewise, Little Ruby Bridges was escorted to her freshly desegregated school by federal marshals in 1960, as was University of Mississippi freshman James Meredith the following year. In the North, residential segregation, or de facto segregation, rather than of laws, or de jure segregation, often prevented white and black students from attending the same schools. The persistence of educational segregation into the mid-1970s led some northern cities, like Boston, to transport black students into primarily white neighborhoods and vice versa to achieve racial parity inside schools. Busing, as it became known, was vehemently and sometimes violently opposed by the lower-income white residents of Boston affected by the plan, which was abandoned by the 1980s. Though today many schools remain segregated, the successful decision in Brown v. Board of Ed opened the door to the fight for desegregation in other public facilities. For example, in 1955, Montgomery NAACP Secretary Rosa Parks' act of civil disobedience set off a 9-month boycott of the city's buses, which ended in their desegregation the following year. In 1960, North Carolina members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, staged sit-ins at a Woolworth's lunch counter to desegregate its restaurant facilities. In 1961, a group of black and white activists, mostly organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, boarded Greyhound buses in the North and traveled to the South together in violation of existing Jim Crow laws. Like the students at the lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, the Freedom Riders encountered violence from those opposed to their cause, but eventually they achieved the goal of desegregation. These examples demonstrate 3 important characteristics of the modern civil rights movement. First, the incidents in Montgomery, Greensboro, and on the Greyhound buses depended on often anonymous individuals taking a stand for their rights. While we all know the name Rosa Parks, most of us cannot name a single lunch counter activist or freedom rider. Nevertheless, their actions helped to spark change from the bottom up. Second, as the group names NAACP, SNCC, and CORE suggest, Many of these individuals decided to take action together, believing that there was strength in numbers. Finally, the boycotts, sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches, the one we just saw was in August 1963, Washington, D.C., where Martin Luther King delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, were all potent examples of nonviolent civil disobedience, or the refusal to obey a law the activists found unjust, but the commitment to do so nonviolently, even in the face of violence from the police or racist whites. The movement's early commitment to nonviolent civil disobedience could be seen in the most heart-wrenching terms, perhaps, during the spring of 1963 in Birmingham, Alabama. Local preacher Fred Shuttlesworth invited fellow minister Martin Luther King to the city to fight its entrenched racism, and together they launched Project C for confrontation. As we'll see in this following video, police used tear gas, dogs, and arrested activists, many of them children, at the daily sit-ins and marches.
Since African Americans comprise 40% of the consumer population of Birmingham, the SCLC decided to target segregation primarily in the business section of the city through economic boycott and prolonged demonstrations. The leaders of Project C also hoped that it would serve as a template for future resistances in southern cities. According to Shuttlesworth, we wanted confrontation, nonviolent confrontation, to see if it would work on a massive scale, not just for Birmingham, for the nation. After small-scale demonstrations in April, the leaders of Project C decided to use a revolutionary new tactic. The final phase of the movement would focus on mobilizing hundreds of Birmingham's youth. On Thursday, May 2nd, the first children began demonstrating. By the end of the day, Bull Connor and his police force had arrested 959 children, ranging from ages 6 to 18. Over the next few days, Connor continued defending segregation at all costs.
Do you think you can keep Birmingham in the present situation of segregation?
I may not be able to do it, but I'll die trying.
Connor ordered his police and fire departments to use dogs and hoses to crush these massive demonstrations. To counter King's tactic of nonviolence, Connor pledged to fill the jails. By May 7th, Connor and his police department had already jailed over 3,000 demonstrators. The situation in Birmingham worsened as Connor proceeded with his relentless attack on the demonstrators. Local business leaders began to change their minds about segregation. Because of the economically crippling effect of the boycott and the state of race relations, the Senior Citizens Committee, a group that represented the majority of Birmingham's businesses, agreed to desegregate lunch counters and hire African American workers. Announced on May 10th, the Birmingham Agreement struck an enormous blow for integration. Bull Connor's extreme actions had clearly backfired. But his violent actions would eventually backfire even more. Pictures and video. The stark contrast of vicious dogs and high-powered hoses with young children dramatically stirred the nation's conscience. As Connor attacked the Birmingham Agreement as capitulation by certain weak-kneed white people, President John F. Kennedy began preparing for a monumental address to the nation. Previously, Kennedy had taken a rather lackluster stance on civil rights for African Americans. However, Bull Connor's alarming actions in Birmingham had alerted Kennedy, along with millions of other Americans, of the dire situation in the South. On June 11, 1963, Kennedy delivered an address on civil rights to the nation.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. This week I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
During his own incarceration during the protests, Martin Luther King wrote his now famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail, in which he eloquently condemns racism and segregation and brilliantly outlines the principles behind civil disobedience. Despite the tragic violence in Birmingham, which included the deaths of 4 young girls inside a church that was bombed later that fall, Project C catalyzed Congress to follow President Kennedy's exhortation to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 following Kennedy's assassination the year prior. Though its initial enforcement mechanisms were weak, this landmark piece of legislation outlawed discrimination in schools, the workplace, and other public accommodations based on race, color, sex, religion, or national origin. 1964 was also notable for the advent of Freedom Summer, when activists, many of them Northern white college students, joined African American activists to register thousands to vote in Mississippi, the state which had the lowest percentage of registered Black voters. Building upon work already begun through Black churches, a coalition of SNCC, CORE, NAACP, and Martin Luther King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, volunteers attempted to rectify decades of Black disenfranchisement by registering Blacks to vote and by teaching subjects like African American history in freedom schools. Unfortunately, many of these volunteers encountered violent resistance from local whites. The most famous of such violence resulted in the deaths of Northern white students Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner and African American Mississippian James Chaney. Several accused of the murders were acquitted in early trials, though others served 6 years for the crimes, and in 2005, one of the remaining suspects was tried, found guilty, and imprisoned 3 times 20 years for the triple murder. Mississippi's reluctance to permit African Americans to participate in the political process in 1964 led to the formation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The MFDP, represented by Fannie Lou Hamer, requested seats at the Democratic National Convention, claiming that disenfranchisement of African Americans in Mississippi had corrupted the democratic process, and thus the state's official delegates did not represent the wishes of the state's 40% African American population. After their denial, internal politics led to the weakening and eventual disbanding of the organization. Nevertheless, the following year, President Lyndon Baines Johnson signed into law the Voting Rights Act, which prohibited racial discrimination in voting and specifically outlawed literacy tests and other impediments that had historically disenfranchised Black voters in the South. Despite the significant hurdles placed before them, thousands of African Americans and sympathetic white allies worked together to achieve many local and state desegregation victories between 1955 and 63, as well as monumental national legislation in 1964 and 65. Before moving on to the next podcast, review the learning objectives for this one. Write each one out in a sentence or paragraph now. If you find that you cannot do so, go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen, and watch again, and pause as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer all of the learning objectives. Good luck!